Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into the intriguing story of how a fake marriage turned into something much more. James Lockwood, a well-known millionaire and tech mogul, stood in the vast ballroom of his family estate. The sparkling chandelier above cast a warm glow on the guests mingling beneath it, but James felt nothing but coldness inside. He'd spent years building his empire, rising to the top of his industry, yet in this moment, surrounded by his wealth and success, he felt more alone than ever. A tight knot of unease settled in his stomach as he watched the laughter and chatter around him. His family had been pressuring him for months to settle down, to marry someone who could properly represent the Lockwood name. But James didn't care about any of that. He cared about results, numbers, and innovation. What he didn't care for was the endless matchmaking his family had set up for him, marriages of convenience, arranged for the sake of business, not love. In fact, love was something he had pushed aside long ago. Years of focusing on his business had left no room for it. He'd been hurt before, and now, the thought of being emotionally vulnerable felt like a weakness he could not afford. But tonight, standing in the ballroom, the pressure from his family was suffocating. James knew they would keep pushing until he gave in, until he found someone to marry, someone who could protect his family legacy. But he wasn't ready to surrender just yet. He wasn't going to let his life be dictated by anyone, not even his family. Enter Olivia Green, a woman who had no interest in the extravagant world James inhabited. She wasn't impressed by wealth or status. She had grown up in a small town, working hard to make a living. A college graduate with big dreams of opening her own art gallery, she was doing everything she could to make it happen. When James' assistant had contacted her for a simple favor, she had no idea what she was getting into. Olivia didn't belong in a room like this, but she had her own reasons for being here. She needed the money, and James had promised her a significant sum to play the role of his fiancée for one evening, just to keep his family at bay. What he hadn't told her was how difficult it would be to pretend to be someone she wasn't. It was just one night, she reminded herself. Just one night. As she entered the ballroom, Olivia couldn't help but feel out of place. She had never worn a dress like this before, never walked in heels this high. The glittering lights and the whispers of the guests made her heart race. She scanned the room, trying to spot James among the crowd. Finally, her eyes landed on him, standing across the room, looking as cold and distant as ever. He was tall, with sharp features and dark hair neatly combed back, his demeanor calm and composed. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but it wasn't this. His presence was commanding, almost intimidating. Olivia swallowed hard as she made her way toward him. "James Lockwood," she asked, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes, and she could see that he hadn't been expecting her. He took a beat before responding. "Olivia Green," he said, his voice smooth but guarded. He gave her a small nod, his lips barely curling into a smile. "I wasn't expecting you to look like this." Olivia felt a blush creep up her neck as she laughed nervously. "I'm just here to play the part, nothing more. I don't usually do fancy events like this." James chuckled softly, the tension easing between them for just a moment. He studied her for a second, his eyes sharp but thoughtful. "I know. That's what makes this interesting." Their conversation shifted into small talk, the usual polite exchanges that felt more like a game than anything real. Olivia told him a little about her life, her dreams, and how hard it had been to make ends meet. James listened, not because he cared about her story, but because he found her unpretentiousness refreshing. She wasn't like the women he'd been introduced to by his family, polished, perfect, and poised for a life of luxury. Olivia was different. She didn't want his money, and that made her stand out in his eyes. But he couldn't let his guard down. This was a business arrangement, after all. They both knew the rules. But something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt in years. As the night wore on, and they continued to talk, he found himself growing more comfortable with her. She was easy to talk to, genuine in a way he hadn't encountered in a long time. For the first time in ages, he didn't feel like a millionaire. He didn't feel like the Lockwood heir. He felt like a man who was just talking to a woman, something simple and human. But he couldn't let himself believe it. He couldn't let himself get distracted. Later in the evening, as the guests gathered for dinner, Olivia found herself seated next to James once again. The tension between them had shifted, and she realized she was no longer just pretending to be his fiancée. Something had changed, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this arrangement might turn into something far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. And that was just the beginning. The evening passed in a haze of music, laughter, and polite conversation. James and Olivia, seated at a table in the grand ballroom, continued their charade, playing their parts as if it were just another business transaction. Yet, despite the formality of the situation, Olivia found herself oddly captivated by him. She wasn't sure what it was, the sharpness in his eyes, or maybe the way he seemed so at ease despite the grandeur of his surroundings. For someone so wealthy, he didn't carry the usual arrogance that came with money. Instead, there was something detached, almost lonely about him. James, on the other hand, couldn't help but notice how different Olivia was from the women his family usually tried to set him up with. She wasn't like the polished, perfect women who only cared about appearances. Olivia was genuine, unpretentious, and had a certain rawness to her that he found refreshing. But that wasn't supposed to matter. This was a business deal, a way to keep his family off his back. She was here for the night, and once it was over, he'd never see her again. That was the deal. He couldn't let himself feel anything else. As the night drew to a close, the guests began to trickle out, but James didn't feel ready to leave just yet. He stood, excusing himself from Olivia, and made his way to the balcony for some air. The cool night breeze hit him like a wave, but it didn't clear the fog in his mind. Olivia's face kept coming back to him. Her laugh, her openness, her lack of pretension. He had never met anyone like her before. Olivia, meanwhile, had retreated to the bar, hoping to get away from the weight of the situation. She never liked pretending to be someone she wasn't, but the money James had promised her was too good to turn down. She glanced around the ballroom one last time. The grand chandelier, the elegant dresses, the expensive wine, none of it felt like it belonged to her. It was all part of a world she didn't understand. But as she finished her drink, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been something more than just a hired hand tonight. There had been moments, small ones, when she had felt like she mattered, but she wasn't going to let herself get lost in it. It was just one night. Nothing more. It was then that James stepped back inside. He was leaning against the doorframe, his eyes locking with hers. There was something about the way he looked at her, as if he was trying to figure her out. She met his gaze, her heart skipping a beat. He was different from the other men she had met in her life. His presence was commanding, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made her feel seen in a way she wasn't used to. "I didn't expect you to stay after everything," Olivia said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost tentative, as if she didn't want to seem too forward. James chuckled lightly. "I didn't expect to either." They stood there for a moment, the air thick with unspoken words. James pushed off the doorframe and took a step toward her. "You don't belong in this world, you know," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. Olivia looked at him, surprised. "And what world is that?" she asked. He shrugged, his gaze flickering to the expensive surroundings. "The one where people care about things like status and appearances. You're different. You're not like them." She raised an eyebrow. "You don't know anything about me." James smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Maybe not. But I know enough to see that you're not here for the reasons everyone else is." There was a moment of silence between them, the hum of the music in the background barely audible over the tension. Olivia didn't know why, but she felt a pull toward him, a curiosity that went beyond the act they were playing. She wasn't sure if it was because of the money or something deeper, something she didn't fully understand. Finally, she broke the silence. "You're right. I'm not here for the reasons anyone thinks. But I have my reasons, just like you." She took a breath, steadying herself. "And I'll be gone tomorrow, same as you." James looked at her, his expression softening. "You think I'll forget you that easily?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Olivia looked up at him, feeling a strange warmth spread through her chest. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I think you'll try." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, As if the weight of the world was shifting in the quiet space between them, James stepped closer. He wasn't sure why he was doing this, why he was feeling so drawn to her, but it was undeniable. She had a way of making him feel something that he hadn't in years. And in that moment, it was more than just the business deal they'd agreed on. There was something real, something raw, between them. "I don't want you to leave," James said, his voice steady but with a hint of vulnerability. "Not just yet." Olivia's heart fluttered, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, this was more than just a fake marriage. Maybe it was the beginning of something else. And maybe, for once, she wasn't the only one pretending. The next few days passed in a blur. Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, but she pushed it aside, telling herself that it was just the excitement of the event and the absurdity of the deal she had agreed to. She had a job to do, and that was all it was. James had kept his distance after their moment on the balcony, but she could tell there was a change in the air, a subtle tension between them that hadn't been there before. She saw him less in the days that followed, as he buried himself in work, as he always did. But she couldn't deny that their brief encounter had left a mark on her. She hadn't expected him to stay in touch, and yet, every time she looked up, there he was, always just out of reach, watching from the distance. She spent her days at the small apartment she had been renting, trying to focus on her art and the gallery she dreamed of opening. But her thoughts kept drifting back to him, to James, to the man who had so effortlessly moved between worlds, from the cold, detached billionaire to someone who, for just a moment, had seemed almost human. She wasn't sure what she had been expecting from the deal, but it was more than just money. She had hoped, foolishly, that she could just keep her distance, remain the perfect actress in the role she had agreed to play. But as the days went on, it was becoming harder and harder to pretend that she didn't feel the pull of something more. James, on the other hand, was trying to focus on the responsibilities that lay ahead. His family was relentless in their pursuit of a marriage that suited their image, but he had grown tired of their demands. His mind kept returning to Olivia, despite the fact that their arrangement was nothing more than a temporary fix. He told himself it was just because she was different, not like the women his family had introduced him to. But as he thought more about it, he realized it was something deeper, something he wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. He couldn't let himself get caught up in this. It wasn't supposed to matter. Olivia was just a means to an end. Yet, despite his best efforts, he couldn't shake the feeling that his world was changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. It was a week later when James found himself back at the bar, sitting alone with a glass of whiskey in his hand. The weight of the week had settled heavily on his shoulders, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to relax. His mind wandered to Olivia again. He hadn't expected it, but she was all he could think about. He thought about their brief moments together, how she had made him feel like he wasn't just a billionaire CEO, but a man capable of something real, something true. He stared into his glass, the reflection of the dimly lit room flickering in the surface of the amber liquid. He should just forget about her. After all, she was just a temporary solution to his family's problem. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. He couldn't get her out of his head. As he was lost in thought, the door to the bar opened, and in walked Olivia. She looked different somehow. The same woman, yet somehow changed. She wasn't dressed in the formality of the event anymore, but rather in something more relaxed, more herself. The air seemed to shift when she walked in, and for a moment, James forgot how to breathe. She caught his eye as soon as she entered, and a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her lips. For a split second, it felt like everything stopped, like they were the only two people in the room. Olivia walked up to him, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she wasn't sure what to say or do. James rose from his seat, the tension between them palpable. "I wasn't expecting to see you here," he said, his voice low, almost gruff. Olivia smiled softly, her gaze not leaving his. "I needed to get away for a bit," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't think you'd be here." They both stood there for a moment, an uncomfortable silence hanging between them. James could feel the pull of something he couldn't explain, and for once, he didn't want to fight it. Olivia took a step closer, the space between them closing with every passing second. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said, her words catching in the stillness of the air. James raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she meant. About not being like the others, she clarified, her voice softer now. I don't know if I believe you yet, but there's something about this, about us. I can't shake it. James' heart skipped a beat. The world outside seemed to blur, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was seeing clearly. He reached for her hand instinctively, his fingers brushing against hers as he took a step closer. Olivia, he began, but his words trailed off. He didn't need to say anything more. They both knew. In that moment, the business arrangement, the pretense, the mask they had been wearing, it all seemed irrelevant. As the night unfolded, the lines between the two of them blurred further. They shared stories, laughed about the absurdity of their situation, and, for the first time, James allowed himself to feel something real. Something that wasn't bound by contracts or expectations. For once, it wasn't about what was expected of him. It was about what he wanted. What they both wanted. And as the evening came to a close, Olivia found herself feeling something she hadn't in a long time. A sense of belonging, of possibility. She wasn't sure where this would go, but for the first time, she was willing to find out. James looked at her, his gaze soft but firm. I didn't expect this, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I'm glad it's happening. Olivia smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. So am I, she replied softly. So am I. The following week, James and Olivia found themselves caught in a whirlwind of emotions neither of them had expected. What began as a simple arrangement, a business deal to keep his family off his back, was now something much more complex. They were both struggling to make sense of what was happening between them. James had always been guarded, but Olivia, with her sincerity and warmth, had found a way to break through his walls. Every day they spent together made it harder to pretend this was just an act. The lines between fake and real were blurring more and more. Olivia was still trying to keep things in perspective. She had agreed to this arrangement because she needed the money, and now that it was starting to feel more real, she couldn't help but feel conflicted. She didn't know how to navigate this new territory. One part of her felt like she was finally getting close to the kind of person she had always wanted to be. Someone who was free to follow her passion for art, without the constant worry of bills and survival. But the other part of her, the part that had always kept a guard up, was afraid. Afraid of getting too close, of letting her heart go where it shouldn't. Because deep down, she knew this was just supposed to be temporary. James, too, found himself grappling with this unexpected connection. He had always prided himself on being in control, both in business and in his personal life. But with Olivia, everything felt different. Her authenticity, her ability to make him feel like a real person instead of just a business machine. It was both unsettling and intoxicating. He had never allowed himself to get this close to someone, especially not someone from a world so different from his. But with her, it was easy to forget about the money, the power, the empire he had built. All that mattered was the way she looked at him, the way her presence filled the room, the way she made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. One evening, after a particularly intense week of meetings, James invited Olivia to dinner. He wanted to talk, to understand what this was, what they were becoming. He had never been one for grand gestures, but something in him urged him to reach out. He needed to know where they stood. They met at a quiet restaurant, tucked away in a corner of the city. The lighting was soft, the atmosphere intimate, and for once, James felt at ease. There was no pressure, no family, no obligations. It was just the two of them. As they sat down at the table, their conversation started off light, with Olivia making jokes about his stiff demeanor and James playfully teasing her about her modest roots. But the laughter didn't last long. Slowly, the conversation turned more serious. Olivia, James said, his voice softer than usual. I need to know what this is. I don't want to play games anymore. I don't want to pretend this is just a contract between us. I don't think I can anymore. He paused, searching her face for any sign of judgment. I've been avoiding this, but I can't anymore. I don't know if it's just me, but this, whatever this is between us, it feels real. And I don't know what to do with that. Olivia took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment she had been dreading. The moment where everything would either crumble or shift into something else. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and saw not just the billionaire CEO, but the man who had opened up to her in ways she hadn't expected. A part of her wanted to pull away, to say that this was just a fling, that they had made an arrangement, and it was time to move on. But another part of her, the part she had spent years suppressing, wanted to reach out, to take his hand, and tell him she felt the same way. "James," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "I don't know what this is either. But I'm not going to lie to you. I feel it too. I feel something real, and that scares me." She let out a small laugh, but it was more of a release than anything else. "I've spent my whole life trying to be independent, to make my own way, and this thing we're building, feels too much like a dream. A dream I'm afraid to let myself believe in. I don't want to get hurt. And I don't want you to get hurt either." James reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers in a gesture that was almost hesitant, but full of meaning. "I don't want you to be scared, Olivia," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not asking for something perfect. I just want to see where this can go. I want to see if we can make it work. If we can take something that started as a lie and turn it into something real." They sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of their words hanging between them. For the first time, Olivia didn't feel the need to run. She didn't feel the need to protect herself. Maybe it was because of the way he was looking at her, or maybe it was because, for once, she felt like she was finally being seen for who she really was. The walls she had built around herself for so long were starting to crumble, and she was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do everything alone. "Okay," Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's try. Let's see where this goes. No more pretending." James smiled, a real smile, not the one he put on for business meetings. It was genuine, and it was for her. "No more pretending," he agreed. And just like that, they both knew that they had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like anything was possible. The days following their conversation were filled with an undeniable tension, but this time, it was different. Olivia and James found themselves spending more time together, both inside and outside of the walls of the mansion. The facade of the fake marriage was still in place, but the lines between pretense and reality had become increasingly blurred. They weren't pretending anymore. They were connecting, on a level neither of them had expected. Olivia could see the shift in James. His once cold and calculating demeanor had softened around her. He seemed more present, more human, and for the first time in a long while, Olivia didn't feel like she was just part of a transaction. But it wasn't easy. Every time Olivia allowed herself to get close, her past fears crept back in. She had always prided herself on her independence. She had worked so hard to carve out a life for herself, one that didn't rely on anyone. But with James, everything was different. He wasn't just offering her money. He was offering something far more precious: his time, his attention, his affection. And it scared her. She didn't know how to navigate this. Was this just a fleeting moment, a temporary escape from their respective worlds? Or was this the beginning of something real? James, too, was struggling with his emotions. He had never been good at letting his guard down, especially not with someone he barely knew. But with Olivia, it felt different. She wasn't like anyone he had met before. She didn't care about his wealth or status. She cared about him, the person he was underneath the facade of the billionaire CEO. And that was something he wasn't used to. He wasn't sure what he wanted from this, what he wanted from her, but every time they were together, it felt like the possibility of something more was just out of reach. He could feel it, like a thread tugging at him, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to follow it. One afternoon, as they walked through the city together, James stopped suddenly, looking at Olivia with a serious expression. She turned to face him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated, his lips pressed together as if debating whether to say the words that had been weighing on his mind. "I'm starting to think this might be more than just a business arrangement," he said, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "And I'm not sure if I'm ready for that." Olivia felt a pang in her chest, a mixture of relief and fear. She had been feeling the same way, but hearing him say it out loud made everything feel more real. "I know what you mean," she replied softly. "It's hard to know what's real anymore. But I think that's what's been bothering me. I don't want to go through life just pretending. I want to know if there's something real here." They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. The noise of the city buzzed around them, but it felt distant, like it belonged to another world. The world they were in now felt different, quieter, more intimate. James finally broke the silence, his voice steadier now. "I don't know what this is, Olivia. But I know that I don't want to let it go. I don't want to lose whatever this is between us. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She had known, deep down, that this was coming. The moment when they would both have to confront what was happening between them. But now that it was here, she didn't feel as scared as she thought she would. Instead, she felt a strange sense of calm, like maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. I don't want to lose it either, she said, her voice steady and sure. But I think we need to stop pretending. We need to figure out what we really want from each other, what we're really willing to give. James nodded, his gaze never leaving her. Agreed. No more pretending. No more games. Let's see if we can make this work, without all the lies and assumptions. The rest of the day passed in a quiet haze, the air between them charged with something unspoken but undeniable. They spent the evening at his penthouse, the conversation flowing easily, but there was something deeper now, something more vulnerable in the way they spoke to each other. James found himself laughing at things he would normally brush off, and Olivia felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt in a long time. By the time they parted that night, it was clear to both of them that the boundaries they had set for themselves had been crossed. There was no going back now. They had stepped into something that was no longer about money or pretense. It was about trust, about being vulnerable enough to let someone in. And neither of them was quite sure where it would lead, but for the first time, they were both willing to find out. As Olivia walked out of the building, she felt something she hadn't in years, a sense of hope. And as James watched her leave, he couldn't help but feel the same. Whatever this was between them, it was real now. The following weeks were a blur of moments, quiet dinners, shared laughter, and deep conversations that seemed to peel back the layers of the people they had once been. James and Olivia spent more time together than they ever expected, and with each passing day, the connection between them deepened. It wasn't just a fleeting attraction anymore. It was real, and neither of them could deny it. Olivia found herself opening up in ways she never had before. She talked about her childhood, the struggles she had faced, and her dreams of opening an art gallery. James listened with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time in her life. But it wasn't just about her. James began to share parts of himself he had locked away for years, the pressures of his family, the loneliness that came with being at the top of the corporate world, and how hard it had been to trust anyone. Olivia understood that pain better than he realized. She had felt it too, just in a different way. One evening, as they walked through the park, the air crisp with the change of season, Olivia turned to James, her heart heavy with the words she was about to say. "James," she began, her voice tentative. "I think I need to know where this is going. I don't want to rush into anything, but at the same time, I don't want to keep pretending that we're still just playing a role. It's starting to feel too real, and I need to know if you feel the same way." James stopped walking, his eyes locking with hers. The truth was, he hadn't expected to feel so strongly about her. He had convinced himself that this was just a temporary arrangement, a business deal that would solve his family's problems. But with Olivia, it was different. She was different. He had been reluctant to let his guard down, but now, he couldn't imagine his life without her in it. He hadn't known how to express it until now. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a step closer to her. "I do feel the same way," James said quietly. "I've been trying to deny it, trying to keep things under control, but I can't anymore. You're right. This isn't just some arrangement anymore. It's real, and I want to see where it goes. I don't have all the answers, but I know that I don't want to lose what we have." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. Hearing him say it out loud was like a weight lifting off her chest. She had been holding on to her fear, afraid to admit that she was falling for him. But now, she could see that he felt the same. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't walk away. She had to trust him, just as he was trusting her. "Then let's stop pretending," Olivia said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Let's see where this goes, without any more walls between us." "I'm ready, James." "If you are." James smiled, his eyes softening as he took her hand in his. "I'm ready," he said, his voice full of conviction. And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. There was no more pretending, no more hiding behind the facade of their fake marriage. What they had now was real. Over the next few weeks, their relationship blossomed in ways neither of them had anticipated. They spent less time worrying about appearances and more time getting to know each other on a deeper level. Olivia was no longer just the woman playing a role. She was the woman who had come to mean everything to him. And James wasn't just the cold, distant billionaire anymore. He was the man who had opened his heart to someone who saw him for who he truly was. But even as their bond grew stronger, there was still one obstacle they hadn't fully addressed: the expectations of his family. James knew that once they found out about the real nature of his relationship with Olivia, there would be consequences. His family had always been about appearances, about maintaining their status, and they would never accept a woman like Olivia in their world. He wasn't sure what would happen, but he knew he couldn't let that stop him. He had to make a choice: live up to his family's expectations or follow his heart. One evening, James invited Olivia to dinner at his family's estate. It was a risk, he knew, but it was time to face the truth. He had been avoiding this moment for too long, but now he was ready to introduce Olivia to the people who had been the driving force behind his need to hide his emotions for so long. As they walked through the grand halls of the estate, James could feel his heart racing. He didn't know what his family would say, but he knew that this was the moment that would define everything. Olivia, for her part, was nervous, but she was also determined. She had spent her life feeling like an outsider, never quite fitting in with the high society she had been thrust into, but this was different. This wasn't about impressing anyone. This was about James and her, about the life they were building together. And no matter what happened, she was ready to stand by him. As they entered the dining room, James' mother looked up from the table, her expression unreadable. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, it felt like everything hung in the balance. Olivia squeezed James' hand, and he gave her a reassuring smile. This was it. There was no turning back now. And for the first time, James knew he was making the right choice. This was his future, with Olivia by his side. No more pretending. The evening at the Lockwood family estate was more tense than James had expected. As they sat around the lavish dinner table, his mother's cold gaze never left Olivia. It was obvious that she was sizing her up, judging her place in their world. Olivia, however, held her composure, despite the uncomfortable situation. She wasn't here to impress anyone, especially not James. Family. She had already made her decision. She was here for him, and nothing else mattered. James could feel the pressure mounting. The air was thick with unspoken words, the weight of his family's expectations pressing down on him. His mother, as always, was the first to speak. "James, it's good to see you finally settling down," she said, her voice dripping with a mix of approval and something colder, something distant. "But I must admit, I didn't expect this arrangement." She glanced at Olivia, her smile tight and calculating. James could feel his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. "This is Olivia," he said, his voice steady. "She's important to me." He had never said that about anyone before, and the truth of his own words surprised him. He meant it. Olivia had become someone irreplaceable in his life, and no matter how hard his family tried to impose their own ideas of what was best for him, he wasn't going to let them dictate this. Olivia, ever the diplomat, smiled politely, though she could feel the judgment coming from James' mother. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Lockwood," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I understand that this is a little unconventional, but I assure you, I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just want what's best for James." Her words, though simple, were sincere, and for a moment, James saw a flicker of something in his mother's eyes, something almost like approval. Almost. The dinner dragged on, filled with polite conversation and thinly veiled barbs disguised as compliments. Olivia, however, remained unfazed. She had always been good at keeping her emotions in check, especially when it came to moments like this. What did it matter if his family didn't approve? She was here because of James, not because she cared about winning anyone's favor. After the meal, James' father joined them in the sitting room. His presence was commanding, but unlike his mother, he didn't seem as concerned with appearances. Instead, he looked at Olivia with an appraising eye, as if trying to figure out if she was the right fit for his son. James could feel the weight of his father's gaze, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't going to back down now, not when everything was on the line. James' father leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him. "James," he said, his voice deep and deliberate, "you've always been a man who made his own decisions. But now, you're bringing someone new into our world. Tell me, what makes her different?" The question was simple, but the implications were clear. Olivia had already felt the tension between them, but now, it was laid bare. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before answering. I may not come from your world, but I understand the importance of loyalty, of trust, she said, her eyes meeting his father's without hesitation. I'm here because James means something to me, and I believe in him. I'm not here for the money or the status. I'm here because of the man he is, not the empire he's built. Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, there was silence. The weight of her sincerity seemed to reach even his father. James watched as his father's expression softened, just slightly. He hadn't expected Olivia to handle this situation with such grace. He had expected her to feel intimidated, to shy away from his family's scrutiny. But she stood tall, not just for herself, but for their relationship, and James realized just how much that meant to him. After a long pause, his father finally nodded. You're right, he said simply. James has always been a man of his own making. But don't forget, this family is his foundation. If you're in his life, you're in ours too. His words weren't a blessing, but they weren't a rejection either. It was the closest thing to acceptance James could hope for. The evening ended with no dramatic conclusions or grand gestures. But for the first time, James felt a shift. His family hadn't accepted Olivia with open arms, but they hadn't dismissed her either. It was progress, and it was all he could ask for at this point. As they walked out of the estate later that night, Olivia turned to James. That wasn't so bad, she said, a playful smile on her lips. You did great, James replied, his voice filled with genuine admiration. He could feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't worried about how his family would judge him. He was focused on what really mattered, the woman beside him, and the life they were beginning to build together. And as they drove off into the night, James knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The following weeks were filled with a sense of calm that both Olivia and James had longed for. But beneath that calm, a storm was quietly brewing. James had always been a man of action, but now he found himself questioning everything. The stakes had changed. His relationship with Olivia was no longer a business arrangement. It had grown into something more profound. Yet, the world they inhabited was not one that easily allowed for change. His family had made their peace with Olivia's presence, but that didn't mean the pressure had completely subsided. James was still expected to uphold the legacy of the Lockwood name, to maintain the carefully crafted image of perfection that had been built over decades. And Olivia, despite her strength and resilience, had always known she didn't fit into that world. They both knew it was only a matter of time before they were forced to confront it. One evening, James and Olivia sat in his penthouse, the city skyline stretching out before them. The lights of the city seemed distant, a world they had no part in. Olivia looked out at the view, her thoughts drifting, when she felt James' gaze on her. He had been unusually quiet that night, and she knew something was on his mind. She had learned to read him in a way that others never could. His silence spoke volumes. What is it? She asked softly, not needing to elaborate. She could sense the weight he was carrying. James hesitated, taking a deep breath before responding. I've been thinking a lot, he began, his voice low. About everything. About you and me. About this. About how far we've come. And I don't want to mess it up. His words were raw, filled with the vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see. Olivia turned to face him, her heart aching at the sight of his unease. James, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, you're not going to mess it up. You're already doing the best you can. We're in this together, okay? You don't have to carry the weight alone. She reached out and placed a hand on his, offering him the reassurance he needed. James looked at her, his eyes searching hers for the certainty he had always lacked in his own heart. I know, he said quietly, but I don't want to let you down. I don't want my family, my life, to be the reason you're not happy. I've been so caught up in their expectations that I forgot what it means to truly live. He paused, his voice catching for a moment. I think you've shown me what it means to be free, Olivia. You've reminded me of who I really am, not the person everyone wants me to be. His admission was as much a revelation to himself as it was to her. Olivia smiled softly, a mix of relief and affection flooding her chest. I'm not asking you to be someone you're not, she said, her voice gentle. I'm asking you to be with me. The real you, the one who isn't hiding behind walls. We've both been through a lot to get here. But we're together now, and that's all that matters. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. We're not alone anymore. Her words were simple, yet they held the weight of everything they had shared up until that point. James nodded, his heart swelling with the realization that he had finally found someone who truly saw him. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, convinced that he needed to protect himself from the world. But Olivia had shown him that real strength came from vulnerability, from trusting someone enough to let them in. Later that evening, as they sat together on the couch, James took a deep breath and turned to Olivia. "I want to take the next step," he said, his voice steady now. "I want us to move forward. No more pretending, no more living in fear of what others think. I don't care about the expectations anymore. I care about you. And I want you in my life, for real, not just as some business arrangement." He looked at her, his eyes full of sincerity. "Will you stay with me, Olivia? Will you take this step with me?" His words were filled with a mixture of hope and the courage that had been hidden beneath his guarded exterior. Olivia's heart swelled with emotion as she looked at him. She had always known, deep down, that their connection was real. But hearing him say it out loud, the sincerity in his voice, made everything feel right. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "Yes, I will. I'm ready to take that step with you. No more pretending. No more running away." She smiled, her eyes locked with his. And in that moment, both of them knew that they were no longer living in the shadows of their pasts. Together, they were stepping into a future where the only thing that mattered was their love for each other. They weren't just playing roles anymore. They were building something real, something worth fighting for. Months passed, and with each day, Olivia and James grew closer, their bond strengthening in ways neither had anticipated. What started as an arrangement, an agreement rooted in necessity, had blossomed into something neither of them could have predicted. They had built a life together, one that was no longer defined by the expectations of his family or society, but by the trust and love they shared. Olivia had proven to James that it wasn't the grandeur of wealth that mattered, but the people you chose to share your life with. And in turn, James had shown Olivia that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, but a strength, especially when it came to love. One morning, as they sat together in the cozy corner of their favorite cafe, James looked at Olivia, his eyes filled with the kind of certainty that only comes with knowing you've found something irreplaceable. "Olivia," he said, his voice soft but full of conviction, "we've come a long way from that first night, haven't we?" She smiled, nodding. "We really have," she replied, her voice warm. "It feels like a lifetime ago, but in the best way possible." James reached for her hand across the table, his fingers gently brushing against hers. "I don't want to waste any more time, Olivia. I know what I want. I've known for a while now." He paused, his heart beating faster. "I want you for the rest of my life." Olivia's heart fluttered at his words, a mix of surprise and joy flooding her chest. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The world outside, the noise of the cafe, all of it faded away as she looked at him, her heart racing. She could see it in his eyes, the sincerity, the love. And in that instant, she knew she felt the same way. She had never imagined that her life would take this turn, that she would find herself here, with him, so completely and unconditionally. She had been afraid before, but now, she felt nothing but certainty. She squeezed his hand, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, I want that too. I want to be with you always." Her smile grew as she saw the relief and happiness flood his face. James stood up from the table, pulling her into his arms. The world around them seemed to melt away as they stood there, wrapped in the warmth of each other's embrace. He kissed her forehead gently, a promise of everything they had yet to experience together. "Olivia, you've changed my life in ways I didn't even know were possible," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent my life building walls around my heart, but you've shown me that love is worth everything. I don't ever want to let you go." Olivia closed her eyes, letting the moment sink in, knowing that everything she had ever wanted was right in front of her. Later that evening, in the quiet of their apartment, James took Olivia's hand once again. This time, he led her to the balcony, the city lights sparkling below them. He looked down at her, his heart full as he dropped to one knee. Olivia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in surprise. James smiled up at her, his voice full of tenderness. "Olivia Green," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Will you marry me?" The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Olivia was speechless, overwhelmed by the depth of his love. She looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears, before she whispered the only word that felt right. "Yes." James stood, pulling her into his arms as they both laughed through their tears. The future was uncertain, but in that moment, they both knew that as long as they were together, nothing else mattered. They had found something real, something worth fighting for. They had found love, and it had changed everything. The world outside could wait, because for them, the only thing that mattered was what they had built together. And so, their story continued, not as a fairy tale or a business arrangement, but as a love story built on trust, vulnerability, and a promise to always choose each other. The next chapter was theirs to write, together,